nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram namashristam manumapi shachiputramatra swarupam rupam tasyagrajamurupurim maturim goshtavatim radha kundam girivaramaho radhikamadavasham prapto yasya pratita kripaya shri gurum tam natosmi pancha kalpatarubhyascha kripas sindubhyaiva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah namo mahavadanyaya krishna prema pradayate krishnaya krishna chaitanya namne gaura tvishe namah jayatam surato pango mama mandamate gati matsarvasva parambojo radha madanamohano kulari devatamar madanamohan jar sevak raghunatha rup sanatan jaya rupa sanatana bhatta raghunath Sri Jiva Gosvami dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadana Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambhojo Julisam Janma Janmani. By the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Vaishnava Charjas, the crest jewel of Rasikas of Srimad Bhagavatam, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we continue our discussion of Padyavali. And we'll continue in the prakaran called Prema Subhagya, or the great fortune of Prema. So in the last discussion we discussed the first verse of this section, which spoke about how the heart is melted by Prema, be it Bhagavan's heart or be it the Bhakta's heart, whether you take the one interpretation or the other. It is Prema that gives rise to melting of the heart by means of the bliss that it produces. So this is one way of illustrating the fortune of Prema, that it produces a superlative experience of bliss. So now this verse that we'll discuss today presents or illustrates how Prema is a great fortune from another perspective. That is, how rare and difficult it is to attain. This is another way of understanding that something is a fortune, to understand the price that it costs to get it. So that will be our subject of discussion today. So this verse is, according to all editions of the Padyavali that I find, attributed to an anonymous author. However, you can find some circulating the idea that it's composed by Ramananda Rai, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that in any of the works that we have known to be composed by Ramananda Rai or here in any editions of Padyavali. But perhaps this attribution arose because sometimes some editions of Padyavali list the name of the author before the verse and some after, and perhaps somewhere along the lines someone took a mention of the name Ramananda following the previous verse to indicate that he's the author of the following verse, but that's just a speculation as to how the attribution came about. In any case, whether it's by Ramananda Rai or not, we hear in the Chaitanya Charitamrita that he spoke or cited this verse in his speech with Sriman Mahaprabhu. And as we'll get into in today's discussion, the line of thought presented in this verse seems very much in attune with what would be, if not his own composition, certainly a composition very dear to him. Because we hear in the Chaitanya Charitamrita that what Mahaprabhu heard from Ramananda on the bank of the Godavari, he later passed on to Rupa Goswami in Prayag. And following that, Rupa Goswami went about his presentation of the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu and other works. And as we'll see, this verse ties in very neatly with Rupa Goswami's presentation of the nature of bhakti in the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu. So, without further ado, I'll read the verse and then we'll get into some commentary. kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa-bhāvitā matiḥ krīyatāṁ yadi kuto'pi labhyate tatra laulyam mūlyam ekalaṁ janma-koṭi-sukṛtair labhyate. Purchase awareness imbued with Krishna bhakti rasa, if it is attainable from anywhere at all. The price for it, further, is hankering alone. It is not attainable by means of meritorious deeds accumulated over the course of even 10 million births. I'll read it one more time. Purchase awareness imbued with Krishna bhakti rasa, if it is attainable from anywhere at all. The price for it, further, is hankering alone. It is not attainable by means of meritorious deeds accumulated over the course of even 10 million births. So as I indicated in the previous discussion, I've compiled some elaborate commentary on this verse, which goes into discussion of sadhana bhakti tattva based on a number of texts, principally the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu, and supplementarily the Durgama Sangamani commentary of Jiva Gosvami on the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu, the Bhakti-sar Pradarshini commentary on the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu by Vishwanath Chakrabarti, as well as the relevant passages to the path of Raganuga-bhakti in the Bhakti Sandarbha, as well as discussion on the section of the Sindhu about Raganuga-bhakti, which is commented on by Radhakrishna Das Goswami in his Sadhana Dipika and his Dashloki Bhashyam. So for anyone who's not familiar, Radhakrishna Das Goswami was the Mahanta of the Govindaji temple in the mid-1600s. He was, you could say, an early contemporary or a generation prior to Vishwanath Chakrabarti, and he has two well-known works, the Sadhana Dipika and the Dashloki Bhashya, a commentary on the 10 principal verses, or the skeletal verses, if you will, of the Govinda Lilamrita. And in those texts, he discusses a number of points and comments on a number of verses from the Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti Prakaran in the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu. So, weaving together some essential material from all of these texts, I've tried to lay out a clear line of thought which illustrates the import of this verse and also gives us some occasion to reflect on and refresh our appreciation for the crisp principles of this path of sadhana that has been taught by Rupa Goswami. And by understanding what we'll discuss, then that will give us some firm grounds for the continued hearing and relishing of this Padyavali that will continue hereafter as we go on to hear about all of the praises of Krishna's name and Krishna's form and Krishna's qualities and Krishna's leelas and what sort of serious business this hearing is, so to speak. So, without further ado, I will get into it. I don't know if we'll get through this whole commentary today, but I think it's worth spending some extra time on, as it will be also like a condensed review of what we studied in the Bhakti Sandarbha, as well as what we studied in the Rupa Shiksha and the material from the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that I presented in relation to the Rupa Shiksha. So, first of all, awareness imbued with kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa, or what's called kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa-bhāvitā matiḥ in the verse, equates to that which is the compiler calls Raganuga-bhakti in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So, one element I'm not going to elaborate on here is rasa tattva and the ingredients of rasa and things like that, because then it will just become too long. So, to keep it short, in gist, Ragatmika-bhakti is that bhakti which, becomes or gives rise to the experience of rasa when the sthāyi bhav becomes, you could say, excited or activated by the vibhavas, and so forth, as it's explained in the second division of the Sindhu. So I'm not going to elaborate on those elements, although you could include that in this commentary, since the verse does speak about kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa. And we should also point out that this is a composition that pre-exists the writing of Rupa Goswami. So it's also significant that we generally credit Rupa Goswami with championing the concept of bhakti being a rasa, but we do find this anonymous verse pre-existing him, which directly states kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa, or describes Kṛṣṇa-bhakti as a rasa. So it wasn't a completely unheard of idea, but its theological underpinnings, or a whole system by which this could be profoundly appreciated, was certainly put forth by Rupa Goswami. So anyhow, for simplicity's sake, we'll just start from the premise of Raganuga-bhakti, or namely the sthāyi bhav, which is the basis from which the experience of rasa comes about. So moving from the definition of Raganuga-bhakti, we'll scale back to address the points in the verse. So first of all, in other words, the verse is saying, purchase this awareness imbued with kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa. Purchase this Ragatmika-bhakti. So then we'll define Raganuga-bhakti and then go from there through the elements in the text. So one other note, I will omit reciting the Sanskrit definitions and passages that I'm presenting from, unless there's some particular word that needs extra note, just to save time. But if anyone wants to clarify the meaning of any particular words, you can see them in the footnotes, and you're welcome to inquire. So, the definition of Ragatmika-bhakti in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is as follows. That which is a cause of natural intense absorption in the object of one's desire shall be called raga. That bhakti which is constituted of, that is, motivated by, as it's further explained in the commentary, that, meaning raga, shall be called Ragatmika-bhakti. So to define Ragatmika-bhakti, which basically just means bhakti made of raga, we first have to know what raga is. So then he gives the definition of raga. So raga is that which causes natural intense absorption in an object of desire. So Jiva Gosvami, he elaborates on this, saying, Sri Jiva Gosvami Pad explains in his commentary on this verse that raga in essence is thirst, or trishna, constituted of prema, for the object of one's favorability, or anukulya. That is, a particular form of Sri Bhagavan, such as Sri Krishna of Braja. He elaborates on this in his Bhakti Sandarbha. A sensuous person's natural affinity, constituted of a profusion of desire for contact with sense objects, is called raga, as in the case of the natural affinity of the eye and so forth for beauty and so forth. So this is very typical, terse Sanskrit writing. So as the eye has a natural affinity for objects that suit it, as the tongue has natural affinity for objects that suit it, as the ears, all the senses have their particular respective objects which among them, those that are excellent, there comes, or we experience this sense of affinity, or this sense of want for those objects. We want to see things that are beautiful, not things that are ugly. We want to taste things that are sweet, or that are of, relishable composition, rather than things that are bitter or unpleasant to eat, etc. So here although he's defining something that's entirely constituted of the Sarup Shakti, something entirely part of divine experience, he's now referring directly to the most universal, commonplace, worldly sensory experience to give us some point of reference for what's being described. So we can start in a very grounded, simple way by reflecting on our own material experience of being embodied, of having senses and perceiving objects with those senses and experiencing pleasure and pain as an outcome of that perception. And having had experiences of pleasure and pain, we then experience this sense of affinity for the objects that cause pleasure and aversion to those things that cause pain. So this is something universal. This is something that doesn't require a lot of intellectual sophistication or complexity. This is something that we can refer to our direct, practical, personal experience to understand. So he says, exactly that, meaning natural affinity constituted of a profusion of desire of a bhakta for Sri Bhagavan too is here called raga. So just as you desire sense objects, just like that, bhaktas desire Bhagavan. So the equivalence is obviously not 100% complete, but it's there. There is an equivalence between these two types of, quote, raga. He's using the same word to describe these two things. So if we can refer to our own experience of feeling our mind almost pulled towards thoughts or engrossed in thoughts of some desirable object of the senses. Maybe we're struggling to do our work, we're getting tired, we're fatiguing, and then we're thinking about something we'd like to be doing or something we'd like to be eating or something that produces some instant gratification which we're not getting in whatever task we're struggling to complete. Then at this moment, we have this experience of raga. We have this experience of the mind becoming absorbed in this object because of this affinity that we have for that object. So just like that, bhaktas, they long for Bhagavan. They think of Bhagavan. Their mind just gravitates into Bhagavan. They're just automatically becoming absorbed in him out of this affinity that they have for him. And that affinity for him, moreover, as it was here said by Jiva Gosvami, is constituted of prema. So it's both a desire for the object and a spirit of favorability, or a spirit of wanting to also do something for that object. So this is where we get somewhat of a distinction, in that the attachment that we might have to sensory experience is predominantly colored by the object producing pleasure for us, or more specifically for our senses. But to have that same level, or even a greater level, of absorption, of interest, of gravitation of the mind, and yet for that interest or that pull of the mind to be colored by wanting to please the object rather than wanting to get pleased by the object, that will be the dissimilarity between the comparison. But that will come or be discussed further later. So, in gist, to summarize, raga is this natural affinity, or here Jiva Gosvami uses the word tṛṣṇa, thirst, which you can translate it literally as thirst, or you could also translate it less literally as strong desire or intense desire, out for this object that one wishes to please. This is defined as raga. So bhakti In other words, acts of service or acts that are pleasing to the object, that are motivated by this type of affinity for the object, that produce automatic absorption or automatic gravitation of the mind towards that object, that is called Ragatmika-bhakti. So, Jiva Gosvami adds to this point, saying, because raga produces natural intense absorption in its object, raga was defined above by Sri Rupa as a cause of absorption in a manner similar to saying ghee is life. So this is a fairly common classical Sanskrit saying, which Jiva Gosvami refers to in numerous places as a hermeneutic to explain points that are being made in the Sarvasangvadani as well as here in the Sindhu. So the idea is that ghee is sometimes said to be life itself because it is known to be a cause of living a long life. So there's also sometimes ways that this is spoken of in English, or another instance of this is the word jivana in Sanskrit, which typically or principally means life, but is also defined in the dictionary as a word for water. Because as we even say in English, water is life, or you can't live without water, no one builds a house where there's no water available. Because water is so essential to life, because it's such a fundamental requisite to living, sometimes we simply say water is life. So because it's a cause, or it's a highly conducive feature of something, then we equate it with that. So that's the premise, or how this saying ghee is life, ayur gritam, is stated. So similarly, raga is defined here as that which is a cause of natural intense absorption in one's desired object, because raga causes absorption in its object to such a profound extent. So when something is a primary cause of a certain effect, then sometimes it's just called the effect. So he's saying, as ghee is called life because it's a cause of life, so raga is just called absorption because it produces such intense absorption. So if we look at this a little bit analytically through the lens of what's called lakshana, or characteristics or means by which things are distinguished, then we come to the following understanding. It is thus defined by Sri Rupa Gosvami by one of its extrinsic characteristics rather than by means of its intrinsic characteristic of thirst constituted of prema. So these are technical terms. They're defined as we discussed in the Charitamrita, and they're used throughout the Sindhu and other works of the Goswamis. And just as a recap, the idea of an intrinsic characteristic is what's called akriti and prakriti of something, the form and the constitution of a thing. So the akriti and prakriti of a human being is that they have 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 nose and 2 arms and 2 legs and 10 fingers, and their figure has such and such makeup. They appear in such and such a way, and they're made of such and such things. The body is 70% water and has such and such proportion of blood and bone and blah, 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 blah. These are the constitutive elements of a human being from a gross perspective. From a shastric perspective, we can say that living entity which has a faculty of intellect which enables it to follow dharma and enables it to experience transcendence, that is a human being. So these are what's called the intrinsic characteristics, what make up the object. And then in contrast to that, what you call extrinsic characteristics, or tatastha lakshanas, are the effects that an object has on others. So here, when we say that raga is a cause of absorption, then that is not an intrinsic characteristic of raga, that is an extrinsic characteristic of raga. In other words, you're saying raga is causing something. So you're defining raga by one of the effects that it produces. So that's not telling you what it's made of, that's telling you what it does. And in some cases, what something does is more important than what it's made of. In the case of, car parts, we need a spark plug. Like, is the spark plug made of plastic? Is it made of fiber? I don't know, I don't care, I just need a spark plug. So what is that thing called again? Oh yeah, spark plug. In other words, it's defined by what it does. It makes sparks. So it's called a spark plug. A screwdriver drives in screws, it's called a screwdriver. So extrinsic characteristics are not necessarily inferior or lesser than intrinsic characteristics. In some cases, they're more important or more significant than intrinsic characteristics. But to fully understand or define an object, you have to know both its intrinsic and its extrinsic nature. So Jiva Gosvami is, you could say, being philosophically thorough here and saying, in regard to Rupa Goswami's definition, that he has given you a definition of raga using an extrinsic characteristic. So in my commentary, I'm so to speak paraphrasing Jiva Gosvami, I'm supplying the intrinsic characteristic of desire or thirst. So what is raga? Intrinsically, it's a desire, it's a thirst. And extrinsically, what is its effect? It absorbs the mind in the object of the desire. So this point is made clearly in one of the payars in the Sanatana Shiksha, which says, intense thirst, or gada trishna, for one's desired object is called raga. This is the intrinsic characteristic. Absorption in the desired object, this is the extrinsic characteristic. So, I think that's clear. Sri Chakravartipad, in his commentary, elaborates the definition of Ragatmika-bhakti given by Sri Rupa Pad, so that it states both the intrinsic characteristic of thirst constituted of prema, the aforementioned extrinsic characteristic of producing natural intense absorption, and an additional intrinsic characteristic of being activity pleasing to Sri Bhagavan. So Chakravartipad comes in and adds a little bit or elaborates slightly on what Jiva Goswami commented to give us an even fuller picture of the discussion. So he says, the complete meaning is that, quote, paricharya, which means, I've given it here as attendant service. Sometimes it's simply rendered as service, but service is a broad thing. So paricharya specifically refers to service that you do in person to the person, like an attendant, like a nurse or a waiter, or things that you literally do together with the person. Whereas dasya, or service, can be fulfilling a desire, fulfilling an order of the person you're serving. Go get the mail, go to the end of the earth and find such and such jewel, or whatever it may be. Those may be acts of service, but those won't be paricharya. Paricharya will be putting tumble in the mouth and waving the fan and massaging the feet and doing these personal acts of attendance to the person directly. This is the distinction between what in the 9 limbs of bhakti, what is called padaseva and dasya. Padaseva is synonymous here with what's called paricharya. So he's saying that attendant service or paricharya to Sri Bhagavan in the form of stringing gardens and so forth, which is prompted by that thirst constituted of prema, that is an evident cause of natural absorption in the desired object, namely Bhagavan, is called Ragatmika-bhakti. So this is very nice, because if we say Ragatmika-bhakti, as Rupa Goswami has defined it, is bhakti constituted or motivated by raga, then still what exactly is that bhakti? Right? Bhakti, as it was defined, as we discussed in the last class, is action of any type possessed of favorability. In other words, action which is by its constitution pleasing to Bhagavan, that is called bhakti, or service. So this action, which is pleasing to Bhagavan in the form of serving him, in performing acts such as making a garland, he gives this example, and when that act of service is prompted by or inspired by this thirst or this intense desire for Bhagavan, such that the mind becomes absorbed in Bhagavan under the effect of that desire. That is what you call Ragatmika-bhakti. So the person's body is engaged in an activity of personal service to Bhagavan, and the person's mind is completely absorbed in Bhagavan in the spirit of favorability or anukulya, in the spirit of seeking to please him. So this is how Ragatmika-bhakti is defined. And Jiva Gosvami, in the Bhakti Sandarbha, he adds a little bit of broader detail, which is also relevant here. He says the following: since natural raga has distinctiveness, that is of various types, on account of each of its manifestations having a distinctive bhava, the characteristic of which is a particular sense of identity or abhiman in relation to Bhagavan, namely that of being a servant, friend, a nurturer, or a beloved of Bhagavan, the bhakti on their part, that is, on the part of Bhagavan's personal associates who have one of these senses of identity, beget by a particular raga and consisting largely of hearing, praising, remembering, serving the feet, offering obeisances, and submitting the self to Bhagavan, is known as Ragatmika-bhakti. So what's added in this point of Jiva Goswami, which is important, is this concept of abhiman, that the person also has a specified sense of identity and relationship with Bhagavan. In other words, when Bhagavan is a person, anyone who's serving him has some type of relation with him. So what is that relation? The person will have some sense of self, which is the basis of that relation. We can't have a relation with an other without a concept of self. So in all cases of Ragatmika-bhakti, as it's explained by Rupa Goswami and elsewhere in the Sindhu, Ragatmika-bhakti is had by those who foster a particular sense of identity in relation to Bhagavan. And he gives 4 broad categories of servants, friends, nurturers, and beloveds. And then there are many subcategories of each of these. I'm not going to elaborate on all of that. We've already discussed many of those points in our discussion of the Rupa Shiksha. I think people are acquainted with that. What's significant at this point is just that Ragatmika-bhakti is acts of service motivated by this desire constituted of prema, with the effect that the mind is absorbed, and that is all happening in the case of a person who has a specified sense of identity in relation to Bhagavan, of being his servant, his friend, or what have you. So, in summary, Ragatmika-bhakti is bhakti to Sri Bhagavan that is motivated by raga for him, and that is performed by associates of him who foster a specific sense of identity in relation to him, namely the sense of being either his servant, friend, nurturer, or beloved. So, having now defined raga, defined Ragatmika-bhakti, we'll now move to the definition of Raganuga-bhakti. So the word Raganuga literally would mean raga following, or sometimes academics translate it as passion pursuant. So it's only when we have a definition of raga and Ragatmika that we can then define and understand the significance of, quote, following raga. So Rupapada writes, that type of bhakti which follows the Ragatmika-bhakti vividly manifest in the residence of Braja and others is called Raganuga-bhakti. So bhakti that follows the Ragatmika-bhakti of particular Ragatmika bhaktas is called Raganuga-bhakti. The import here is that Raganuga-bhakti is a form of sadhana bhakti, the aim of which is the attainment of a specific type of Ragatmika-bhakti, be it a form of either dasya, sakya, vatsalya, or madhura rati. So the verse under discussion's use of the verb purchase creates an implied analogy that can be articulated using Sri Rupapad's terminology. I have to say, as I was writing this, I had to check myself from writing about this verse as if it was composed by Rupa Goswami, because it fits his line of thought so exactly that it's as if you're like explaining his own verse, but it's actually his system that's being used to explain the verse. So I had to edit that a couple of times. So what is the implication? As a highly valuable object can be purchased from the person in whose care it is kept, so Ragatmika-bhakti can be attained by following the path of Raganuga-bhakti. So when you buy an object, you go to where it is and you get it. So the way to get this awareness imbued with kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa, or this Ragatmika-bhakti, the purchasing process, that in the analogy, the purchasing process is Raganuga-bhakti sadhana. The commentator thus renders the sense of the first half of the verse under discussion as follows. If that awareness, meaning Ragatmika-bhakti, is attainable from anywhere at all, meaning from any bearer of dasya, sakya, vatsalya, or madhura rati, by means of being a follower of theirs, then purchase it. Meaning, then take up the path of Raganuga-bhakti, aimed at that particular rati, by taking shelter in and following that bearer of such rati, that is, the bhakta in whom such rati is present. So the verse is saying, buy it wherever you can find it. So what does that mean? It means go to the sadhu who has this rati and follow this path of Raganuga-bhakti so that you can attain it. This verse under discussion is also cited by Sri Ramananda Rai as an illustration of Prema Bhakti in the midst of his reply to Sriman Mahaprabhu's inquiry regarding the ultimate object of spiritual attainment. In the commentary on Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, attributed to Sri Vishwanath Chakravartipad, the aforementioned point in regard to this verse under discussion is affirmed by the explanation given there. Quote, if attainable from anywhere at all, meaning from any source in the form of association with a sadhu, then purchase, that is acquire, awareness imbued with, that is permeated with kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa. So when it says kuto'pi, from anywhere, what does that mean? It means from some sadhu. Doesn't mean you're going to find it in a shop or in a tree or some random place. Where is this state of awareness? It's going to be in a bearer of awareness. It's going to be in a person. It's going to be in a bhakta. So when he says purchase it from anywhere you find it, means from any sadhu who has it. Thus, it is to be understood that purchasing awareness imbued with kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa from anywhere at all refers to following the path of Raganuga sadhana bhakti under the guidance of a sadhu, and more specifically, a sadhu whom one accepts as one's guru, with the aim of attaining a specific form of Ragatmika-bhakti. The commentator adds that the mention of, quote, if, indicates that this awareness imbued with kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa, namely Ragatmika-bhakti, is difficult to attain. And that, quote, at all, or api, indicates any instance of possibility, meaning one should take any chance one gets to purchase it, if one is so fortunate as to find even one such chance, meaning to find the association of a sadhu who can lead one on the path of Raganuga sadhana bhakti. So sometimes we hear Baba stress these if, like yadi. Sometimes he'll hammer like remember this. Whenever in some commentaries he'll be like, look, remember the if, meaning is not guaranteed that everyone is going to find this. It's not that in any lifetime any person gets this chance. There's no guarantee that anyone has the opportunity to do this at any given time. If someone is so lucky and is able to recognize how lucky they are for that if to come to take its place in their life, then they should not waste such an opportunity. This is the spirit of the statement. So, now we come to the second half of the verse. So the commentator, segueing between the first half and the second half of the verse, he offers a reflection, or what would be the response of the listener. They've just received this order. Buy this awareness, wherever you can find it. So when I hear this command, go and buy it, then what might I think? Hearing this advice, one may reflect, and this is the commentator's analysis. He says, in the case of purchasing and acquiring something that is highly valuable, both a large sum of money and a profusion of meritorious deeds, that is, a great deal of good fortune produced by one's past good deeds, are required. So how shall I, who am poor in both respects, ever be able to purchase, that is, attain, this Ragatmika-bhakti? So this is, perhaps you could say this is a very Indian analysis. From a Western perspective, we usually just think about money. We're not necessarily thinking, well, I don't know if my karma is good enough to allow me that. But pious people, they think that way. In any case, if I come along and I say, if you get any chance to ever acquire a Rolls Royce, just buy one. You might think, well, okay, sure, I understand you're trying to tell me that Rolls Royces are like the most wonderful type of fancy car there could be, but I'm going to need a lot of money that I don't have to buy one of those. So what can I do with this advice of buy a Rolls Royce? In other words, if I don't think that I would ever be able to have the money to buy it, then even if you give me this great advice, invest, $50,000 in this stock and you'll have, 3 million in 10 years. Just do it. Whatever you do, just invest 50,000 in this stock. It's like, well, if I don't have 50,000 to even invest, then, what good is this kind of talk for me? It's, it can just kind of roll off. I'm just throwing out a few examples. In other words, you might think if there's this very valuable thing, then the main reflection that someone is going to have is, well, how do I get the money? How do I get the purchase power? So, in expectation of this question, the second half of the verse states that the price required for this purchase is hankering alone. The word is laulyam. Meaning, Ragatmika-bhakti cannot be attained by any amount of conventional meritorious deeds. That is, it cannot be attained by any quantity of conventional acts of duty, austerity, charity, and the like, even a vast quantity of such acts accumulated over the course of 1 crore of births. So this is the distinction between bhakti and karma. No quantity of karma results in bhakti. Bhakti is something unique to itself. And desiring bhakti is also something distinct from karma. No matter how much karma you do, that doesn't necessarily produce any desire for bhakti. These are two parallel tracks. The acts of karma can purify the chitta of sins. They can produce a sattvic state of mind, but just a sinless sattvic state of mind doesn't in and of itself have any inclination or affinity or attachment for bhakti. These are two distinct lines, if you will, that don't cross. So it's only desire for this that will lead to the attainment of it. Simply doing other things that are considered good won't ever help you end up there. So why not? The mind cannot foster raga, and remember, how was raga just defined? Raga was defined as intense desire that produces intense absorption for one particular object, meaning Bhagavan. So, when does the mind, or how does the mind become intensely absorbed in one object? That's what I'm explaining here. So I say, the mind cannot foster raga for one particular object when it sustains vasanas, or inclinations, for numerous other objects. Try meditating. Why does your mind get restless? Why does it go here and there? Because you have all these samskaras and vasanas for all these different types of experience. Therefore, the mind hops from this object to this object to that object. It doesn't remain fixed or absorbed on one particular object. So we've just defined raga as this thing that's going to totally absorb the mind in Bhagavan alone. So doing all these activities that nourish and deepen samskaras for objects other than Bhagavan, doing that for 10 million lifetimes, is that going to produce one-pointedness upon Bhagavan? It's just not going to happen. Pious, impious, whatever it is, whatever you culture in the mind, that's what the mind becomes habituated to thinking about. Unless and until you fix the mind on Bhagavan, the mind will never become fixed on Bhagavan. This is stated directly by Krishna in the 11th canto, dhyatis avishaya dhyatis chittam vishayeshu visajjate. When the mind is fixated upon objects of the senses, it merges into objects of the senses. And how does the other half of the verse go? Mayeva praviliyate. I forget one of the lines, but it says, and when the mind is fixed in me, it's absorbed in me. Fix it on that, it goes to that. Fix it on me, it goes to me. Very strong, simple logic. So doing all these activities, which might be considered pious or valuable in the world, but which aren't directly fixing the mind on me, it's not going to get the mind any closer to me. So this threshold, this resistance, produced by all the past conditioning of action unrelated to Bhagavan, has to be persevered through. It has to be pushed through, such that the vasana, the samskara for thought of Bhagavan, is nurtured and strengthened, whereby gradually it becomes easier and easier for the mind to fixate on Bhagavan. There's just no other way. This is how the mind works. And one has to, work with the nature of the object. Because we all know if you try to operate an object contrary to how it's built, you're never going to get your job done. You pick up your phone and say, I want you to do this. The phone doesn't listen. The phone works just the way it's programmed by the developer. It doesn't matter what you're thinking in your head. So similarly, the mind has its way of working. You need to work with that. So this is the law, if you will. Etad guyam sanatanam. This is the eternal secret. Yat chittam tanmayo vasham. Where the mind is, there it shall remain. This is the eternal secret. The central thread of the entirety of the world of dharma, psychology, bhakti, everything. So, the mind must be made one-pointed upon the object of Ragatmika-bhakti by means of intense desire for it. Since nothing fixes the mind upon a single object more so than intense desire for the object does. So, one can try to fix the mind on an object using reasoning, using argument, out of obedience to injunction, or out of fear of death, or fear of punishment, or fear of whatever coercive means one is subject to. But the mind will never become so naturally and strongly absorbed in that object that one wants to fix it on if one doesn't really desire the object. Someone might, in a moment of fear of death, run and cling and greatly desire something, but as soon as the threat of death is gone, poof, their interest in that object is also over. So, but when one truly cherishes an object, when one truly desires that object, then the mind will just remain perpetually riveted there. So this law, if you will, of how the mind works, the Bhagavatam in the 7th canto, and here on the basis of that, here Rupa Goswami, they're working with the nature of the mind. They're not trying to work against the nature of the mind. They're saying, this is how the mind works. It gets strongly absorbed in things that it desires. So let's create this path of spiritual practice whereby rather than trying to force the mind to focus on things that it doesn't desire using discipline, let's create a whole set of resources that engender desire for the thing that we want the mind to fixate on. And rather than trying to force fit the mind onto the object, let's recondition the mind to just gravitate on the object by its own accord. And this is essentially what the genius, if you will, of the Ragatmika or the raga-based concept of bhakti is. And this is why Jiva Goswami argues that it's more powerful than Vaidhi bhakti. And actually, only this is bhakti. Because it's only when the mind is really functioning in its full natural strength in favor of this process that you really experience a realization of the potential of the human faculties. So this is the realization of human life. This is the realization of all human potential, of all psychological potential. So to discern how the mind works and then to build a system of sadhana that favors, if you will, the tendency that the mind in and of itself has, this is the genius of the Goswamis. And of course it's there in the Bhagavatam, but the way that they've brought it out, the way that they've systematized it, this is the great, Mahavadanya, this is the munificence, this is the wonderful grace that we've been given in these teachings and by these, eternal associates of Bhagavan. So, coming back to the point, only when the mind is made one-pointed in this way can Ragatmika-bhakti manifest there. Conventional acts of duty, austerity, charity, and the like neither nourish one-pointed desire for Ragatmika-bhakti, nor purge the mind of desires and vasanas for other objects. Therefore, not even 1 crore of lifetimes worth of such deeds can enable one to, quote, purchase, that is, attain Ragatmika-bhakti. So, I think that point is clear from the final line of the verse, but the most important point is the actual thing. How do we actually purchase it? What is it that's going to enable us to go through this purchasing process? How do we get the money, so to speak? So he says, what then can enable one to, quote, purchase it? The author replies, the price for it further is hankering alone. So then, what's the question? How do I get the hankering? How do I get the money? It's like, I want this. Okay, I need this much money to get it. Okay, how do I get the money? This is, when the practicality of it all comes down to this. How do I acquire the means to acquire the object? So that's what the whole rest of this commentary is focused on. So Rupapada states the eligibility for the path of Raganuga-bhakti, that is the requisite state of mind to attain Ragatmika-bhakti. Quote, one intensely desirous of attaining the bhava of those residents of Braja or others, who are possessed of fixity solely in Ragatmika-bhakti, shall be a bearer of eligibility in this regard. Sri Chakravartipad clarifies that the intended meaning of being desirous of the bhava of residents of Braja is not that one literally desires the exact same bhava that a particular resident of Braja has, but rather that one desires a bhava that is of the same general type, since it is not that a sadhaka aspires to literally become one of the well-known associates of Sri Bhagavan in his Leela, such as Mother Yashoda, but rather that one aspires to become a companion and assistant of theirs, endowed with a bhava akin to theirs. Therefore, he writes, one intensely desirous of attaining a bhava akin to that bhava which those residents of Braja who have fixity solely in Ragatmika-bhakti have in relation to Krishna, shall be a bearer of eligibility for Ragatmika-bhakti is the meaning. And I didn't add it here just to keep it short, but Jiva Gosvami, he also goes further on to say that to aspire to want to literally become one of the principal associates of Bhagavan in his Leela is actually a type of aparad, and it's a type of seeking to become directly constituted of Sarup Shakti, Sarup Shakti being non-different than Bhagavan. It's an attempt to become Bhagavan, or it's an attempt to worship oneself as if one was Bhagavan, or what's called aham grahopasana. So he discounts that. So it's not that one is literally trying to become that, but one wants to be blessed with a bhava of such quality, a bhava of such type of nature and compatibility with theirs, such that one can be blessed to participate among them in that lila, in that service, in that experience of Madhurya. Sri Rupa further describes the characteristic by which one can introspect and infer the relative degree to which any such, quote, intense desire, or lobha, that is, any degree of the hankering spoken of in the verse under discussion, has appeared in the mind. So in the Sindhu, he defines the adhikar, he defines the eligibility. The eligibility is being intensely desirous. The eligibility is having hankering. So then you might say, well then how do I know if I have hankering? What is hankering actually? So then he gives you a principle of introspection. He gives you an explanation of how that hankering comes to be and what is the how to understand that that hankering is there or not there, or how much it is or is not. So he says, upon hearing of the sweetness of their, meaning Ragatmika-bhakta's, bhavas, and so forth, that the mind depends neither upon injunctions nor upon reasoning, is the characteristic of the arising of intense desire, lobha, in this regard. So this statement is a little bit cryptic, and Jiva Gosvami thankfully gives a very nice, completed explanation of this in his commentary. Because if you read the verse and if you translate it carefully according to what it actually says, it's saying that when the mind doesn't depend on injunctions and reasoning, then there is desire. But depend upon, it's not depending, but what is it doing without depending? That he didn't say. And that's the most important thing. So that's what Jiva Gosvami explains. So when Rupa Goswami writes here that the mind, quote, does not depend on injunctions and reasoning, what is it that the mind does without depending on these? Sri Jiva explains this point in his commentary on this verse. The mind flows towards the object of desire, namely the bhava of a particular class of Ragatmika-bhaktas. Thus, the characteristic of the appearance of intense desire, or lobha, is that the flow or gravitation of the mind towards that object occurs without the prompting of injunctions or reasoning. When the mind does this, then it can be inferred that intense desire for that object has arisen in the mind, since the mind would not otherwise flow towards that object in the absence of some injunction or reason for doing so. So, I think that's clear. When you desire something, you just think about that thing. You get lost in thoughts of that thing. You can't stop thinking about that thing. When you really want something, the mind is just going to that thing. So, does that happen to you? Do you ever find yourself, just automatically thinking of this object without trying to, without reminding yourself to, without going, okay, let me sit and do my spiritual, contemplation now. is the mind just going there of its own accord? That's the symptom, that's the indication that there's an intense desire for this. Just as, if you're hungry, your mind starts thinking about food. You don't have to be like, I better eat. It's almost the time I usually eat. Or, someone told me I'm not eating enough. I better eat again today. If you want to eat, there's no need for anybody to tell you to eat. There's no need to argue with yourself. Yes, I should or I shouldn't. When you want to eat, you're already thinking about eating. You don't have to try. You don't even have to use any logic or whatever. The mind's just doing it because you want it. So the word lobha, or intense desire, this doesn't just mean a liking or some inclination. This is something strong. When there's actually a strong presence of this desire in the mind, it will have its effect. It will exert a pull over where the attention goes. So, therefore, Rupa Goswami is saying the characteristic of the arising, meaning the presence of this desire, is that its effect will be experienced. The pull that it will have, the absorbing effect in its object that it will have, will be noticeable in the mind when the thing is there. So in the case of some, one might infer the opposite, or in other words, one might hear this and think, well, I guess I sure don't have any of that, because I don't find my mind just gravitating and thinking about, the prema of the people of Braja. My mind's thinking about the news and politics and arguments and arrogance and all these mundane things all the time, and it's just, anywhere else. Unless, for a few minutes I'm able to sit peacefully and try to remember those things. So okay, that's fine. If that's where anyone is at any given point, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing here to be faked or to be superficially assumed or anything. To have a clear sense of what is the actual state of one's mind, what is the conditioning of one's mind, what is the level of desire that one has or doesn't have for this or that. That should all be soberly, clearly recognized. And as we'll get to later in the commentary, there's a place for everybody to go forward from. It's not that if you don't have this, you're nowhere. This is certainly something desirable, or it's ideal that someone would reach such a state, but actually for the mind to be in such a state is a very precious, very rare, very advanced state of being. So, more detail will come on this as we go through this commentary, as well as how the mind arrives at that state, how that desire gets into the mind in the first place, which is perhaps the biggest question of all. That we'll hopefully get to in the next discussion. I don't want to go too long over 1 hour, so I'll cap it from here. And as a preview, in the next class, what we'll discuss are further meters or parameters for introspection to understand the relative level of desire that one has or doesn't have in the mind related to these topics, as well as the process by which that desire is acquired. And all of that is for the sake of our understanding of what this statement means, that the only price is hankering. So what is that price and how to acquire that money? This is where the discussion is going. So I'll leave it at that for today. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free to share. Nope. All right, very well. Then I'll sign off for here today. And if we're so blessed, in our next session, we'll go further into this discussion. Vaishnavebhyo namo namo. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.